Hmm. 489 hours played. Last played 25th of May 2016. What's the worst that can happen? I had actually planned to get this video out yesterday because, well, by a remarkable coincidence, it would have been exactly 1 year to the day since I last played War Thunder. However, my internet service provider had other ideas. For most of Tuesday, Wednesday and part of Thursday, I basically didn't have an internet connection at all and only managed to get Thursday's video up in the half-hour upload window that I actually had any kind of bandwidth whatsoever. Which meant that I really didn't get a chance to download or even install War Thunder until Thursday afternoon. But that was a bit of a mixed blessing because it meant I was just in time for patch 1.69 and the introduction of the Italian Air Force. Now what today's video is not going to be is a review of War Thunder in general or the new Italian aircraft in particular. You don't stay away from a game for a year, come back, play for 2 hours and then consider yourself to be in a position to review anything. It just doesn't work like that. I would need to spend a substantially longer period of time with this game, not just to re-familiarise myself with it, but to put myself into any kind of position where I could speak with any kind of authority about it. Today's video is just me easing myself gently back into War Thunder, having a look at one of the new Italian aircraft in particular, and basically just giving you my first impressions while we talk about one of those Italian aircraft. Not this one, although this one does seem to be quite fun. This is the F-84G. It's battle rating 7.3, rank 5, and it's armed with, well, that's 24 rockets mounted under the wings. I saw the wing-mounted weapon load on this thing, and I thought I have to have a go at this. And it's fun. I've no idea how effective it's going to be, but this isn't the aircraft that we're going to be talking about today. But before we get on to that, I'm just going to try and land this F-84. Because, let's face it, if there is one thing that, even to this day, people remember me for in War Thunder, it's my spectacularly shitty landings. I've even seen somebody in an Elite Dangerous video on YouTube managing to mess up his approach to a space station and called it a Jingles landing. The thing is, these jets are, well, at least for me, very, very tricky to land because, well, I'll show you what I mean. Right now I'm doing just over 400 kilometers per hour. No problem. I'm not getting a stall warning or anything. I have enough airspeed to be able to fly the aircraft. Obviously I want to slow down because I'm making an approach to the landing strip. So I lower the throttle. Airspeed's dropping below 380 kilometers per hour. Obviously I'm turning, so I'm bleeding off even more speed. I'm at about 360 kilometers per hour, and now it's telling me my flying speed is too low. Increase throttle to avoid a crash. So I'm about to stall at 360 kilometers per hour. Well, if I'm at stalling speed, I must be alright to lower my landing gear and deploy the flaps, right? Well, you'd think so, wouldn't you? And you'd be wrong. So it's not playing fair, is it? I mean, is there any wonder I keep crashing aircraft if it's telling me that one speed is too slow to stay in the air, but it's still too fast to deploy my landing gear? I mean, that's just not fair, is it? Anyway, no Jingles landing today, I'm sorry. I hate to disappoint you all. Anyway, what's this aircraft that I was talking about? Which aircraft are we going to be taking a look at today if it's not the F-84G? Well, it's this one. This is an aircraft I have admired for a very, very long time. Back in the 1970s, when I was a very young child, I thought that this aircraft, as well as the Royal Air Force Jaguar, were the two sexiest aircraft in existence. This is the Fiat G91 R1, and it's the current highest battle rating aircraft available for the Italian Air Force in War Thunder. Hot off the press, brand new into the game. It's a rank 5 aircraft with a battle rating of 8.0. What's it like in War Thunder? Honestly, I couldn't say. I mean, I've barely had the game installed long enough to re-familiarise myself with the flight controls. I did attempt to get this thing into an arcade battle, but I sat there in the queue for 2 minutes. There just weren't enough people playing Battle Rating 8 aircraft. And so, well, I mean, I was fully expecting that I was going to get absolutely slaughtered, because you don't jump into a game after being away for a year and expect to do well. But it feels very manoeuvrable, very fast, very light and responsive on the controls. It feels like a lightweight F-86 Sabre, which is right on the money, because that's basically exactly what it is. You see, in the early 1950s, the costs of modern jet fighter aircraft were spiralling out of control, and so in 1953, NATO issued a requirement for a lightweight strike fighter. The idea was that it had to be small, simple, cheap, that could be built in large numbers. It had to be capable of operating from unimproved airstrips, which is a polite way of saying it had to be able to land and take off from a field, because in the event of a Third World War with Soviet Russia, major air bases were likely to receive unwelcome attention from nuclear missiles. And so aircraft that could land and take off on unimproved airstrips were obviously going to be in high demand. Simplicity was also very, very important, because if you had to land and take off from a field, you couldn't expect to have lots of expensive maintenance equipment nearby to rearm, refuel, and if necessary, repair you. To keep the costs down, it had to be a single-engined fighter, and since at the time Britain was leading the world in the development of jet engines, the Bristol Siddeley Orpheus turbojet engine was selected as the power plant. Half a dozen different aircraft firms submitted design proposals, but only 3 were selected for evaluation: 2 French designs, neither of which would be successful, and the Italian design from Fiat, which would result in this aircraft, the G91 R1. While neither of the French designs won this contract, they weren't completely unsuccessful. One would go on to be developed into the French Super Étonnard naval strike fighter of Falklands War fame. An Argentine Super Étonnard launched the Exocet missile that sank HMS Sheffield, and the other design would eventually become the Anglo-French Jaguar strike fighter. The American Northrop Corporation also submitted a design, the N156, but that didn't even make it as far as the finals, which was kind of ironic, because the N156, although it wasn't accepted into the lightweight strike fighter program, it did eventually emerge as one of the most wildly successful export fighter aircraft ever manufactured in North America. Northrop didn't have a huge amount of luck with the domestic market, except at the Top Gun school at Miramar, where their brand new lightweight fighter would be used to simulate MiGs and Soviet aircraft by the aggressor pilots in the Top Gun school. I am of course talking about the Northrop F-5 Freedom Fighter, which is one of the most successful export aircraft ever sold by North American aviation industry. So, considering that the G91 managed to beat out aircraft that would go on to become the Super Étonnard, the Jaguar, and the F-5 Freedom Fighter, it must have been something pretty special. Well, the aircraft was the brainchild of a design team that was led by Fiat's Giuseppe Gabrielli, hence the designation G91. In fact, the aircraft's nickname was the Gina. It was pretty clearly modelled on the North American F-86 Sabre, license built by Fiat, although scaled down with an empty weight that was around about 65% that of the Sabre. Like the Sabre, it had all swept flight surfaces with a low-mounted wing, featuring a 37-degree sweep and a conventional tail arrangement with dual air brakes followed by the landing gear. It had tricycle landing gear, all of the gear assemblies had single wheels, the nose gear retracted backwards, and the main gear fitted in the inner wings retracted inwards towards the fuselage. The landing gear was optimised for rough field operation. The aircraft could fly off fairly muddy surfaces. As already stated, the power plant was a Bristol Siddeley Orpheus 803 turbojet, which provided 22.2 kilonewtons, or 5,000 pounds of thrust. The sort of budget version of the Sabre comparison also extended to the armament. Rather than 6, it had 4 Browning M3 50 caliber machine guns mounted in the nose, 2 on each side. The nose assembly on the G91, which is the most obvious physical difference between the G91 and the Sabre, will explain why the G91 is sometimes referred to as a reconnaissance fighter. It actually contained 3 cameras, one of them pointed forward, and one each pointed to either side. You can see that there is a single stores pylon under each wing. Now these were initially meant to be wet stores pylons for carrying external fuel tanks, but since the aircraft was supposed to be operated from makeshift airstrips fairly close to the battle line, it was never really seen that it would be necessary to carry external fuel tanks on this thing. And the external stores load on the G91 wasn't great. It could only really carry 680 kilograms or 1,500 pounds of stores. But as you can quite clearly see here, it did mean that the aircraft could be fitted with 2 pods of folding fin aerial rockets. And you can have fun with these rockets here in War Thunder. Not just when going after bombers, by the way, because believe it or not, that's exactly what these things were originally designed for. In fact, one version of the Sabre was on with nothing but these rockets. If your aim is good, however, it's not unheard of to be able to take fighters out with them as well. I'm putting that one down more to luck than judgment. They can be very effective going against bombers, however. I mean, that is what they were designed for. I recommend that if you are going after a bomber using these rockets with the G91, then you should probably set the detonation range to about 600 meters, close in at full speed, do one pass and start firing at about 1,000 meters out. Even if you don't hit the bomber, the explosion should be enough to cause significant damage. Italy was not the only air force to operate the G91. The Luftwaffe placed an order for them in 1958, initially obtaining the G91R3 in 1960. It was pretty much like the Italian Air Force G91Rs, except they were armed with twin 30mm cannon with 125 rounds per gun instead of the 4 Browning machine guns. They also had 4 stores pylons, the airframe was reinforced, and they had a slightly better avionics kit. The initial 50 German G91s were actually built in Italy by Fiat, but the remainder, 295 of them, were built by a German consortium headed by Dornier. This means that the Italian Fiat G91 has the distinction of being the first true combat aircraft to be built in Germany since the end of World War II. Thanks to politics and nationalism, however, the idea that the G91 was ever going to be a universal light strike aircraft for NATO just never really caught on. The French placed an order early on, but they quickly cancelled it, preferring to go their own way because, you know, they're French. The British weren't interested, instead preferring to focus development on the much heavier and more expensive Hawker Hunter. The Greeks and the Turks placed orders for the G91R4, which was very, very similar to the Luftwaffe G91R3 with 4 50-caliber machine guns and 4 external stores pylons, but they changed their minds and went ahead and bought the Northrop F5 Freedom Fighter instead. The 50 built for the Greeks and the Turks would eventually end up in Germany with the Luftwaffe, but they wouldn't stay there. Norway expressed an interest, but the Norwegian version of the G91 would have required extensive modifications because, well, Norway's kind of big. And one of the problems of the G91 was that it had very, very short legs. Its operational range was pretty bad. Without external fuel tanks, the G91 was never really capable of attacking a target more than 170 miles away from its airstrip. And even then it would only have a 10-minute loiter time at combat speed over the target area before having to return at cruising speed. Thanks to its light weight and a relatively powerful engine for its size, the speed was very nice. It had a maximum speed at altitude of 1,075 kilometers per hour. It's not supersonic, but it's not far off. Surprisingly, both the US Air Force and the US Army actually evaluated this aircraft in the tactical strike and forward air controller role. Unfortunately for the G91, the US Air Force ended up not being interested, while the US Army still expressed interest. They were in the middle of a big pissing match with the US Air Force over who would retain control of fixed-wing aircraft, an argument that the US Army lost, because while the US Air Force can be said to be good at many things, it is definitely better at politics than anything else. Besides Italy and West Germany, there was only one other nation that ever flew the G91, and it was the only nation that ever flew the G91 in combat, and that was Portugal. And it's in Portuguese service where the story of the G91 starts to get interesting and more than a little bit naughty. You see, from 1961 onwards, Portugal, which was ruled by a dictator at the time, began to get involved in a series of colonial wars to retain ownership of its overseas empire. Portugal had acquired a whole bunch of F-86 Sabres from the USA on the grounds that they would be used for self-defence only. Portugal's dictator, ever a practical man, immediately saw the potential use of the F-86 Sabre in putting down popular revolutions in his overseas colonies, and so dispatched a couple of squadrons of F-86 Sabres initially to Portuguese Guinea. Understandably, America, a country that has a fairly well-known history of resisting imperial rule, wasn't too keen on this idea and petitioned the United Nations to impose an arms embargo upon Portugal, to which the UN agreed. This left Portugal with a little bit of an air cover problem for its colonial armies, so they immediately began shopping around for a replacement. Initially, they approached Germany. Germany had a whole bunch of Canadian-built F-86 Mark VIs, which Portugal was keen to get their hands on. Germany also, however, had, do you remember those Greek and Turkish G91s that proved to be surplus to requirements? And while the Greek and Turkish G91s, which the Luftwaffe found themselves holding on to, were reasonably similar to the G91R3s that the Luftwaffe was equipped with, there were enough differences that the logistical problems when it came to maintenance of the two different aircraft were creating Germany enough problems that they were keen to get rid of them. And it turned out the G91 was actually ideal for the Portuguese requirement. It was, after all, designed to be operated from unimproved airstrips with minimal maintenance requirements, absolutely ideal for fighting a colonial war in the middle of the bush in Africa. All Germany wanted out of the deal was permission to build an airbase in Portugal for flight training purposes. Portugal immediately said, "Shut up and take my airbase." The first squadron of Portuguese G91s arrived in Portuguese Guinea in 1966, where they were immediately put to work putting down the rebels with rockets, bombs, machine guns and napalm. Things were going remarkably well for Portugal. However, since the Portuguese Empire today basically consists of a chorizo factory on the island of Madeira, you can probably guess that things did not continue to go well. Enter, stage left, those practical jokers in the Soviet Union who thought it would be hilarious to begin equipping the rebels with the SA-7 Grail man-portable air defence system. All of which proves that the Russians just have no sense of humour, because they didn't think it was funny when the CIA started doing the same thing with Stingers and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Nevertheless, things were not going well for Portugal. They were losing a number of their G91s, and not just in Portuguese Guinea, as the colonial revolutions spread to Mozambique and later on Angola. With her colonial air forces encountering ever stiffer opposition and under the threat of a United Nations arms embargo, Portugal realised that they were going to have to do something sneaky and probably more than a little bit naughty. What happened next can basically be summarised like this. Portugal approached Germany and said, "So, Germany," Germany said, "Yeah. You know how you're not really supposed to be selling us any weapons because of this whole United Nations arms embargo thing?" "Yeah. Well, what if, maybe you were to build some of those G91s that we like, except you then broke them down into spare parts and sold them to Spain and Switzerland? You couldn't really be held responsible if we were to then get our hands on them and reassemble them locally with new serial numbers, could you?" And the Dornier company said, "All right, we'll do it." Which would have been fine for Portugal until the West German government heard about it and immediately said, "Portugal, nein!" And so Portugal got their wrists slapped and had to make do with what they had. But the wars would not last forever, because in April 1974 the Portuguese government fell in the Coronation Revolution, and the new government immediately set about granting all of its former colonies independence. And that was pretty much it for the operational history of the Fiat, although later it was known as the Air Italia, G91 lightweight strike fighter. The last G91 was phased out of Luftwaffe service in 1982, Portuguese service in 1993, and Italian service in 1994. So what did everybody think of the G91? Well, the Portuguese loved it. They couldn't get enough of them. The Germans, despite building more of them than anybody else, they didn't really like it that much. Some people claim it was underpowered. Yeah, I'm not too sure about that. The F-86A Sabre only had a thrust to empty weight ratio of 0.5, Nobody ever claimed that the Sabre was an underpowered aircraft, and yet the G91 had a thrust-to-empty weight ratio of 0.7. I can't say how realistically it's been modelled here in War Thunder because, well, I've only really played it in the arcade flight model so far because I've only had my internet back for a few hours. But, well, it kind of feels like the polar opposite of something like the British Hawker Hunter, which is a very fast, powerful and heavy aircraft, whereas the G91 feels very fast, light, agile and responsive. It's almost like the difference between a Hellcat and a Zero, for example. I suppose the fairest thing that you could say about the G91 in real life, aside from the fact that it looks absolutely gorgeous, is that it met the specifications for which it had been designed. And its failure to be adopted more widely among the NATO member nations was more down to nationalism and politics rather than any defect in the design of the aircraft. The G91 currently sits at the top of the Italian tech tree with a battle rating of 8.0, and while it's certainly possible that we may see the Luftwaffe version of this aircraft, because the Luftwaffe did operate the G91R3, it's unlikely that we're going to see anything more advanced than the G91, purely by virtue of the fact that some of the G91s were wired for the Sidewinder heat-seeking air-to-air missile, and I don't think we're ever going to see heat-seeking air-to-air missiles in War Thunder. And the aircraft that succeeded this, the Italian Air Force AMX, was armed with a Vulcan 20mm rotary cannon, and I don't think we're going to see that on an aircraft in War Thunder anytime soon either, although I believe the Brazilian version of the AMX was equipped with twin revolver-style 30mm autocannons, so maybe, possibly, we may yet see more advanced aircraft than this in the Italian tech tree. But if this is the pinnacle of what we can play with in the Italian tech tree, I'm okay with that, because I like this aircraft. Remember, when I was a young boy in the 1970s, this and the Royal Air Force Jaguar were, as far as I was concerned, the two sexiest things in the air. Obviously, I was very young and very stupid at the time, taken in by the allure of jet aircraft when I should have been paying much more attention to glorious prop-driven aircraft like the Supermarine Spitfire, which were obviously clearly superior. But it does hold a special place in my heart. Well, that's pretty much it for today. Back in War Thunder for the first time in almost exactly a year. Unfortunately, due to the continuing problems which I'm suffering with my internet service provider, although things have been better today, and when I say today, I mean Thursday, the day I'm recording this, and in combination with the fact that I'm spending Friday and Saturday at the MCM Expo Centre for Comic-Con this weekend, it means I just haven't had the time or the bandwidth to get a video ready for Saturday, so there will be no casual Saturday video this week. I'm very sorry, but don't blame me, blame my ISP. Hopefully, normal service will be resumed in time for Mingles with Jingles on Monday. I certainly hope so. Anyway, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.